So there's some interesting debate within historians, amongst historians, as to whether or not Ireland actually is an example of secularization, or whether or not it's a counterexample. These are, well, I find these really interesting debates, whether or not Ireland actually challenges this notion that as a society becomes more modern, it becomes more secular. Okay? Because some research suggests that church attendance in the Republic of Ireland in particular remained extremely high throughout the 20th century. So I wanted to just, before we move on to the case studies, remind you that history is more about the small stuff, it's also about the big stuff too. And some of the big ideas that have been floating around in religious history for a while, that if you're thinking about embarking on or looking at religion in your local area, might want to think about. And I think I've mentioned some of them already. One of them is this period between 1780 and 1840 as a time of religious reform and renewal. And it really is a time of considerable structural change for all of the Irish denominations. And it's also a time of considerable theological ferment as well. Don't forget 1798's occurring in the middle of all of this, and all the ideas coming over from France. And these all had a big impact on religious ideas too. And so you've got everybody's kind of thinking about new stuff. And this is really when Methodism in Ireland begins to take off, and when Evangelicalism, which later on comes to characterize and dominate Irish Protestantism, really begins to dominate in Ireland. So it's a very interesting. So if you're looking at this period, you might want to be aware of those ideas. So, for example, I've looked at baptism and birth and marriage registers for County Down for this time, and they're dreadful. It's clear that it was a very disruptive time, and therefore keeping good church records was difficult. The other big idea that floats around relates to the fortunes of the Catholic Church in the 19th century. So an American historian called Emmett Larkin has basically spent 30 years arguing that the famine had a devastating impact on the Irish population. But what it did was that it transformed the Irish people from a relatively low mass attending population to one that was almost 100% mass attending in the years after the famine. So he argues that the famine had this massive impact on mass attendance and on the attitudes of Irish Catholics to the Catholic Church. He argues that in the pre-famine period, most Irish Catholics probably didn't go to church for one reason or another. Either it was the survival of folk faith, or it was the inability to actually get to a church within easy walking distance of your home, or whatever. This devotional revolution has been largely challenged because lots of historians have found evidence of the Catholic Church reviving itself well before this time. Nevertheless, it's an interesting argument, and so it's one to always sort of keep in mind in the back of your head. The third sort of big idea is this notion of the triumph of evangelicalism. You might, again, you coming from Northern Ireland, and if you come from a Protestant tradition, it might be hard to imagine a time when open-air preaching and a belief in the literal translation of the Bible wasn't actually what everybody thought. But in fact, in the 17th and the 18th century, the theological diversity of Irish Protestantism was far greater than it was by, say, the middle 19th century. The growth of evangelicalism, with its emphasis on a conversion experience, with its emphasis on active missionary outreach, really transformed the character of Protestantism and has given it its very modern character, which we still see here in Ulster today. But that hasn't always been the way. So if you're looking at, say, the Anglican Church in the 18th century, it could have a very, very different character. You might find clergy smoking, or wine being served at vestry meetings. But these things would have all been, quite acceptable before the advent of evangelicalism, and the temperance movement would have really changed people's moral values and attitudes towards those sorts of things. And finally, then, the point that I made earlier, the fact that Ireland's trajectory in terms of secularization and our movement away from religious faith is very, very different, potentially, than it is in other countries in Europe and farther abroad. So with all of that in mind, I wanted to then look at a couple of case studies, and look first of all at the case study of St. Enoch's congregation. Okay, so I think if you're thinking about looking at religion in your local community, I think probably what you want to do are identify your local denominations, first of all. Establish which churches were in operation and when within your area. And then chart the clergy who've occupied positions of authority within those churches over your time period. I think you might want to think then about looking at, say, internal church practices. Like, for example, church building. Where did it come from? Who was the architect? What did the interior look like? Who decided that? What did that say about the church and the way they saw their faith? What did the religious services look like? What were the books or the service books that were used? What were the ideas and beliefs of the clergyman? Can you find any sermons that he would have preached? And then looking at things like social support groups for people who attended the church. Were there little, like in Methodist circles, there would have been class meetings attached, or Sunday schools, these sorts of things. Did those exist? Have they left any records behind? Once you've looked at the internal structures, you could then move to look at the way in which that church is operated in its external environment. Looking at, for example, charitable groups, or looking at the support for the poor, or looking at missions. External relationships would also maybe include things like were there any scandals, or were there any sort of sectarian incidents of sort of interfaith rivalry. And a really great example, and one that I would love to see explored in more detail, is the tension between Anglicans and Presbyterians over burying in graveyards. Because up until the 1860s, the Presbyterians didn't have the right to bury in their own graveyards. And so they had to bury their dead in parish graveyards, which meant they had to ask permission from the parish clergyman, who sometimes was a little bit sticky about it, for whatever reason. And there are lots of, I've come across, a handful of references to altercations and fracas between the funeral party on the one hand, where the coffin gets put on the ground and everyone's going at it with fisticuffs because the parish clergyman is trying to block the entrance to the church because due process hasn't taken place. So these sorts of things, I think, really reflect that the wonderful interaction between religions within the local area that is often missed at a national level. Okay, so that's all the hard stuff over and done with. That's you going to school for the day, and now I'm going to tell you a story or two, so everyone can sort of take a deep breath and relax, and hopefully the story will be an entertaining one. Because as I said earlier, I wanted to just look at the way in which I've tried to reconstruct the history of St. Enoch's Presbyterian Church in Belfast. And as you can see here, Hugh Hanna was the minister of St. Enoch's. It originally started out as a Berry Street congregation, and so I might need to backtrack a wee bit and maybe just say a wee bit about Hanna himself, in that he was ordained in 1852 in Belfast, and he'd been working as a missioner with a group of people in an area of Belfast called St. Anne's Buildings, which is in the western part, of the city, but we would know as, say, West Central. Now, they didn't have their own congregation. After he was licensed by the Presbyterian Church to preach, they sought trying to establish themselves as a congregation, and they bought an old six-seater Presbyterian church, Berry Street, which is still there actually. If you come up the back entrance of Castle Court and you head down Chapel Lane, on your left-hand side is like just a sort of a church hall really now. But there's a wee plaque on the side that says Berry Street Halls, and I think that's pretty much all that's left of the original site, but that's where it would have been originally. And they were there between 1852 and 1869 when the cost of repairs to this very old building were getting too great. The congregation had grown too large to really be accommodated successfully within the church, and Hanna was extremely ambitious as a clergyman, and they embarked on a massive building project. And I'm sorry to say I don't actually have a photograph of St. Enoch's because, as most of you know, it's been torn down since. But they, between 1869 and 1872, they built the largest Presbyterian church in Belfast on Carlisle Circus. And it had 3 galleries, 3 main entrances on the front of the circus, and it could seat upwards of, I believe, 3,000 people. So it was a hugely ambitious project. Hannah was clergyman there between 1872 and his death in 1892. So he had a massive impact on this particular congregation. Now, the way I came across Hannah was because I was really interested in the 1857 riots in Belfast, which Hannah was actively involved in. And this is a minute from the Presbytery of Belfast, recording a special meeting that they had to talk about Hannah's involvement in the riots. And eventually, on the next page, they pass a resolution, and they desperately say to him, they implore him to please give up, to cease and desist preaching in the open air because it's inflaming community relationships. He kind of says, well, only if you agree with me that open air preaching is something that should always happen and that we always have a right to do, and you don't think that this is me caving into the mob. And they're like, okay, yeah, whatever, right? And he goes, well, okay then. And then he does, and he agrees to desist. So that's kind of what sparked my interest, really, was this sort of hot-headed minister. You have to imagine, Hannah was born in 1821, so in 1857, he's not really all that old. He's only in his mid-30s, okay? Now, the Presbyterian Church is quite good in the sense that if you're interested in trying to find a congregation, there is a wonderful little publication, A History of Congregations in the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, which will provide you with a little potted history to get you started. Okay? There's another little publication as well, and lots of denominations have these, which are indexes of clergy. And these are really useful starting points. So down here, you can't see this, but I'm going to tell you that here's the entry for Hugh Hannah. And what it does is it provides you with lots of his basic biographical detail. Things about like where he was born, who his father was, what his father did, and all the rest of it. You don't necessarily believe it all, but nevertheless, they're useful jumping off points for going on to explore for yourself. Okay, because I would have had no idea that Hannah was actually born in Derry Townland in Dromara in County Down. And I went off and checked. And it says here that he's born in 1824, but in fact, when I checked the actual register, it was 1821. Okay? And in fact, Hannah's birth date is recorded 7 different ways, in a variety of different sources, and I think only one actual printed and published source actually gets it right, which proves to me that hardly anybody goes and checks the baptism registers, which strikes me as being like local history 101, right? So none of you are going to do that, right? The next place to go, obviously, would be any published congregational histories, okay? So in the 19th century and 1890s, this was sold at a church bazaar to raise money. It's full of advertisements. John Barclay is a leading Presbyterian historian and Presbyterian minister, wrote History of St. Enoch's, and then you can find actually small pamphlets, which I'm going to say nothing about, that have been published as well. All of those, whether or not you actually believe everything they say, they are still useful jumping off points for finding out more.